Great. Welcome back to Senate Education this Friday, April 5th. 4 minutes after 2, final work of the day is page 873, PCBs in schools, Secretary Moore. As I mentioned, I do have the lead of 245, so
Yes,
yeah, thank you.
thank you. And so I am joined today by Matt Chapman, who's the head of our waste management division where this work sits, and then Secretary Boucher from the Agency of Education. And my thought for this afternoon is we at ANR and working in conjunction with our partners at the Health Department and the Education Agency had put in sort of an alternative plan to proceed with testing at a pace that matches the resources available to support the work, and would like to walk you through that. Matt may be able to help answer more detailed technical questions should you have them. And in some ways, the legislature's already begun work on what I would describe as our alternate proposal by virtue of passing the Budget Adjustment Act. And as you may recall, the Budget Adjustment Act transferred $3.5 million from our solid waste management assistance fund into the environmental contingency fund that works in the instance of PCB testing in schools, works together with the reserve that's been created in the Ed Fund to support the remediation and mitigation. And the environmental contingency fund is actually what is at this point paying for the testing work, both the initial air testing, I believe, as well as the follow-on materials testing. As I'll show in just a minute, this change. Let's try and join the meeting again without hitting the audio. This change has some important, we believe, administrative benefits for schools as well, in that running the materials testing work through the environmental contingency fund allows us to assume the lead role in overseeing that work. Under the current scenario, schools are responsible for managing that work and then seeking reimbursement out of the education fund. So over the summer, as well as right up until the beginning of the session, we have met on multiple occasions with the superintendents and principals associations, working to understand their concerns and their feedback, and some of the pieces they pointed to as being particularly challenging for school and building administrators are reasons we propose this change as well. Now in the meeting, and we'll share my screen and walk you through our proposal. Okay. So this is kind of an overview of where we were at as of January 1st of this year. There are 324 schools that we've identified that need to be tested and that they were built or renovated prior to 1980. As of January 1st, we had completed that work at 96 schools and had an additional 22 with sampling plants. We are now up over 100 schools where we have completed testing and continue to have an inventory of roughly 20 schools with approved sampling plants. To date, we are finding that about a third of all schools tested have at least one space in the school with results above the school action level. So that's the health threshold established by VDH. Of those 35 schools at that instance that had an exceedance of the SAL, about a third of them, or 13% of all schools tested, have PCB detections above the immediate action level, which is a level at which we believe there's no safe amount of exposure time. So this is a somewhat long-winded way of saying there is a considerable amount of PCB contamination that exists in Vermont schools. We did make an effort in building our sampling strategy to identify a set of criteria to help us prioritize this work. That said, this is relatively novel work. And so our confidence in being able to say to you, the schools at the end of the list have less risk of PCBs is a little bit squishy, or maybe even more than a little bit squishy. We're really learning as we go through this work. And haven't, I don't think, seen a change in kind of the percentage of schools where we're seeing exceedances of the SAL as we've gone from 50 school universe to 100 school universe. They continue to grow. So in terms of funding, and I know this has been a cause of significant concern. As of January 1st, there was the unexpended balance in our environmental contingency fund that we had dedicated to this work of just about $1 million. The proposed transfer, which has now actually occurred as part of the 24 BAA of $3.5 million, meaning we had about $4.5 million of unexpended balance to support both the indoor air testing and follow-on materials testing. And then there is the reserve that was created in the education fund. As you may recall, 16 million of that was set aside for Burlington High School. At this point, we have remitted about $10 million of that to Burlington High School, and $6 million remains in the Ed Fund Reserve. And then there was about $9 million of the balance that remained available for all other schools. I point this out because a cornerstone of our proposal in continuing this work was using the data we've had to date in terms of the cost of testing, both the air testing and the materials testing, as well as the cost of mitigation, and saying how far can these dollars carry us? And we believe that the answer to that is we can test roughly 65 additional schools through the end of June of next year. So through the end of next fiscal year, with the resources available. And I'm going to scroll down so you can see the table where we get into this, and that we now have done 100 schools. So we do have, I think, fairly robust data when it comes to the average inventory and sampling costs, as well as some information, and would describe it as being a little less robust when we have those detections, because that universe is smaller. We've gone from 100 schools that's reflected in these average cost numbers above to 35 schools that's reflected in the next three lines here, the indoor or the materials sampling, the quarterly monitoring, and the evaluation of corrective action alternatives. And we have only one school thus far, I think, although maybe we're now up to two that have gone to the corrective action. Okay, so still just one with a corrective action plan. So know that $35,000 number, sample size of one. But using this and being conservative, taking the high end values from our tables and carrying them forward, we believe that the testing activity to complete those additional 65 schools will cost approximately $4.5 million. Oh, no, excuse me, $1.4 million. And then when we move into the remediation space, we've again made estimates based on the percentages we're seeing. And our best projection is right now, we're within about $500,000 of having sufficient money to do that. I feel confident in saying, I think we do have sufficient money to do this work, because we've made conservative assumptions throughout. And this is a margin of error of less than 10%. That said, we are committed in this document to tracking that information over time and pausing or further slowing our testing regime should we appear to be on the verge of running out of money. So the proposal that's come to you from the House would in effect pause this work immediately, because it considers only the balance in the Ed Fund Reserve, not the balance in our environmental contingency fund, and would have us work through the mitigation and remediation to understand if there were still dollars left in the Ed Fund Reserve before allowing us to proceed with additional testing.
Please, Senator.
So you said you were kind of learning as you went along. Did any of the criteria change for how you were testing? Did you have to go back to retest any of the schools?
So we haven't, we've made some changes to the order of schools on the list, but it's not been because of a comprehensive change in criteria. Many of the schools where we have detections above one of the action levels, we start with indoor air sampling, which is canisters deployed in rooms that sort of are looking at the ambient conditions. If we have a level detected in one of those canisters that exceeds our action level, we then go into building material sampling. So something is releasing PCBs and causing them to be in the air. And sometimes it's window glazing, and sometimes it's caulk, and sometimes it's paints, sometimes it's roofing materials. But the team goes back in and does that additional, more detailed testing in places where we exceed the action level.
Are you doing that out of height? I mean, are you doing it yourself, the testing, or you hired contractor?
We have contractors, and the contractors for the inventorying, indoor air sampling, and under this proposal for the building material sampling would all work directly for DEC.
Because last year we had somebody in, a professor from, I don't know if she was from Wisconsin or Milwaukee. But she was going all over the country testing, and she said that she had found that the ballast and some of the lighting were causing it, she thought.
Yeah, was that Dr. Hornbuckle?
It
Yes.
was Ohio,
Yeah,
University of Iowa.
yep,
And we're continuing to, can you speak a little bit to the work we're doing with them?
Sure. So Dr. Hornbuckle is the head of the basically the PCB program through the Superfund and EPA. She has a relationship with EPA, and we've hired her to do sort of more detailed sampling and off-gas sampling for us. And we've had her doing that for a year, and it's given us some really good information. She's actually pursuing more grant funding and partnering with Vermont to sort of continue that work going forward.
thank you.
You're welcome.
Please, Senator Weeks.
If I could, thank you for the summary. It's a little hard to follow because the screen, all the time.
No, I'll share this document.
No, I-
and have it.
I get that, I appreciate that. My question is just kind of in summary, the $400,000 gap, is that testing and remediation or just testing?
It's testing, mitigation, and remediation where needed to reduce indoor air levels below the action level.
Okay, thank you.
So, I would also add that we have are in the process of putting in, as I speak, an application to Senator Welch and Senator Sanders for congressionally directed spending that might also be able to help in this space. Understanding that there's a precedent that Alaska has received funding to support similar work.
And the House just raised $135 million in taxes. But if we were to adopt any of those, part something. Thank you.
You're welcome. I don't know, Matt, if there's anything I missed or you, Dad.
I think the only thing I'd clarify is I think, right now the education reserve fund is in the, I think, $8 million range. So it's not an immediate pause, but I mean, certainly it will happen quickly. It's getting there.
So if I understand, H 873 well enough, right, there was for the fund, with the funds available at reach the $4 million point, et cetera, they're recommending pause. If such legislation passes, do you have an opinion on how long that pause should last, and if there should be like a trigger? Okay, we pause for a year, but then we take additional action. Right now, I believe, just calls for a pause. It doesn't talk about a trigger to reinitiate.
Correct. So the recommendations we had given in testimony in House Education were the $4 million figure you cite is related just to what is shown as the AOE total in this table, and actually not including the Burlington money. So it's really just that all other schools line, and as Matt indicated, that's about 8 million. One of our recommendations is it should actually be the sum of these, the amount in the environmental contingency fund along with the amount in the ed fund reserve. We had also recommended putting together a working group, ideally composed of folks from the relevant state agencies as well as legislators, to look at a long-term funding solution that leaving half the schools untested, particularly given the fact that we're seeing a third of them come in with levels that exceed our health department standards is untenable and frankly inequitable, and want to find a way to finish the work we've started.
So last year, there was some question about the EPA standard versus the Vermont standard. Did we ever come partway to an agreement on that, or?
I mean, I think that people have raised questions with respect to Vermont's standard. I mean, I think EPA would tell you that the standard, the TSCA standard is outdated and not the appropriate standard to use. They will tell you that it's based on data from the 1980s, that it's basically left sort of in the rearview mirror for the most part as far as the appropriate standard, regulatory standard.
We're getting a lot of emails, a lot of testimony, please don't stop. Very into it. So,
And so what this is effectively is a proposal to slow the testing somewhat to match the available resources and then also leave time for that important work to figure out how to pay for the balance of the testing.
Thanks, sir. So there was testimony of you, I believe yesterday or maybe the day before, which surprised me, which had to do with the Burlington lineup. That was that it had to be specifically for the testing, remediation, maybe some other qualifiers. Is it anticipated that Burlington will burn through that 16 million? Okay, very good.
Yeah, we anticipate that, although today that we've issued about $9 to $10 million in approvals.
And then one last question about the EPA standards. In the LCAR conversation about PCBs, there was a kind of a discriminator about between EPA and regional EPA standards. And I wonder if you can, because that was the first, but we didn't hear it in here about regional EPA, but I heard it over there. I'm just wondering, just a little bit of clarification.
Okay, so now let me confuse you all endlessly. So
You know
there.
I'm gonna have to watch this on tape. to understand
No,
what you're
and
saying.
I completely appreciate it. So let me draw a distinction between the regulatory standard. So what you use against someone to sort of compel them to do something versus what we call a screening value. So the RSLs, the regional screening values, was what we were talking about in the context of the review of the investigation and remediation of contaminated properties rule. So the EPA maintains a very robust list of what they call regional screening values for various different media, right, including indoor air. And those are non-regulatory and updated informally and not through a rulemaking process much more frequently than the regulatory values are. EPA has not updated its regulatory values since like the 80s. The regional screening values, I can't remember what they are off the top of my head, but they're significantly lower than Vermont's school action level and immediate action level, right? So the concentration that EPA uses to screen and require additional work to be done is much lower than ours. Their regulatory value is much higher than ours, mainly because of, again, the out-of-date material.
You know what would be helpful? Just recommendations, one simple graphic, like 3 columns, Vermont, standards, EPA, regional EPA, any other qualifiers. Because it's hard to know if we're really telling constituents, this is what we're reacting to.
Sure.
And this is, and why. Program, okay, phenomenal, 100% supportive, but the whole issue of standards is because of the LCAR experience, and then again, possibly in health and welfare, just we touched on it. Just not, I can't explain it to a constituent.
Is that something you could produce for us?
Sure. Just very simple, nothing, no.
And that's really something, I mean, it's, a lot of it has to do with the constituent concerns.
Sure.
That we react properly, not say the wrong thing, but we really appreciate what you guys are doing. Question about the differences when we go back and retest. Is it temperature related? Is it, I know that they're going back in and finding more contamination than the previous visit. In some cases, is it having anything to do with sunlight? Is it heat?
You know, there's lots of different reasons why you could see variability in values. It could be airflow and how effective the HVAC is at a given time, whether it's on or off. We found challenges with that.
Maybe?
Well, it actually, believe it or not, it like placement of the unit, the units themselves, right? So if you happen to have placed a unit closer to a source, you will have higher concentrations. So there are some things like that. So there are guidelines that are supposed to be followed. The instances where we found high levels of variation is when people didn't follow the SOPs when they were setting up their sampling.
Dr. Boucher.
I just was gonna go on the record, if that's okay, in support of what Secretary Moore has testified. I think from the Agency of Education's perspective, what we had heard loud and clear from the education field is the burden to actually lift the program. And then also the fear that without a funding source for the full remediation, that local districts would be left holding on the hook for that money. And so I think what we've done at the administration is to try to come back with a reasonable approach that still hold students and employees' health in hand as well, because we want to make sure that that's not lost either. So we're very much in support of the original plan that we had testified on in terms of house education, with the contingency that we do need to collectively do some work together in the ensuing few years, because we do need to find out how we're going to actually fund the full remediation. My understanding is we have some time, as long as we can get mitigation efforts to a place that allow for safety.
Anything else in the presentation? Comments or questions?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. I think the only, my only request is if you have any language that, number one, I know you mentioned you'll send that report,
I will.
but any language that we need to incorporate,
I think we did have a markup of 873 and be
I would
happy
love
to
that.
share that with you.
that
So
would be great. And is that okay for Matt to come in and do, or?
Mhm.
Okay, so we'll have Matt come in, markup of 873, as well as that chart, the different PCB regulatory levels. I think the best way. So, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
One more question.
Oh, I don't think so, yeah.
So I always like to go into a group, if I'm going to go talk to a group, is bring them some good news of this whole process. I mean, eventually, ideally, it's going to go away. Like everything, I was talking, but the operation, we can offer good news.
2/3 of our schools don't have levels of PCBs that raise the level of being a health concern. I think that's a good news story. I don't think we had any sense what the percentages was gonna be going in. That in many instances, we've been able to identify fairly low cost solutions that are able to have significant impacts in lowering action levels.
Those are really.
Those are kind of the
Yeah.
two, the best news
Yeah.
stories,
Yeah.
right? Because in the instances, in the places where we find significant PCBs, it is challenging. But at the same time, these are one of the few known human carcinogens, and so the opportunity to reduce people's exposure to them is really important.
Julie, can I just add to that? So what I might say too is that we recognize that the burden this has put on our schools. And so I think a good piece of news is we're trying to respond to that. We're trying to make that much more reasonable.
Last question. Is there a database on your website or something about, can you forward the link to Morgan? Because frankly, I'm just maybe behind the power curve. I'm not quite sure which one's tested out and which one's
Sure.
in trouble.
Yeah, we have that running list. I'm happy to show that.
He's a daddy.
Do you have it just by the school level versus like the individual or the room, like, yeah.
No, I think we do have it.
Yeah, I think so.
I get a report every week by the school level, so presumably it must exist somewhere.
It gets really detailed. so it's-
Well, I'm sure it does. I just want to be able to talk to parents, talk to
Sure,
superintendents.
no, we can provide that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
You're welcome.
We still have a few more pairs.
Oh, I would take a pair of Eclipse glasses.
Run down.
Thank, oh,
Okay.
I'm all stars.
I'm actually done. I'm actually done.
No, I have people coming, yes, well.
Oh, no, thank you. Do you need any more?